Over the last 30 years, human origin science has reached a very important consensus. And that consensus is that all modern humans today on the planet are descended from a population that lived here in Africa. And that population evolved sometime between 200,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago. And then for some reason, around 70,000 years ago, that population left Africa and spread across the planet in what we call the Great Human Diaspora. And that first population out of Africa was a small population. It could have even been one tribe of peoples. So the origins of advanced cognition, the origins of high levels of cooperation, the origins of modern human behavior lies here in Africa. And many of us think it evolved first on the South African coast. Prehistoric people were always looking for shelter that they could use. And one of the obvious types of shelter are caves and rock shelters. So 400,000 years ago, the sea rose up 14 meters above where it is today, and it carved a whole series of caves down the South African coast. And then the sea retreated during glacial phases, and those caves formed natural homes for the Stone Age people. And they, of course, used them, and they came in and built up big sediment stacks, right, of discarded material. And then, if we're lucky as an archaeologist, we discover those caves, we come in and do an excavation, and saved there in that cave is hundreds of thousands of years preserved of ancient human activity.
The Middle Stone Age archaeological sites along the Cape South coast have some of the richest habitation of early humans anywhere on Earth, early Homo sapiens, our early ancestors. These records go back as far as 160,000 years. I'm going to ask you to imagine a landscape under the sea. Behind us right now, there's shimmering blue, but in fact, if you could find the plug and pull it out and watch the water slowly disappear, what you would see exposed is a now extinct, totally submerged terrestrial landscape. We call it the Paleo-Agulhas Plain, and the interesting thing about the last 160,000 years is that for most of that time, sea level has been lower than what it is right now, and the Paleo-Agulhas Plain would have been exposed. When you expose the submerged landscape, you get closer to where the Agulhas current flows. So in fact, there would have probably been quite a pleasant coastal climate that allowed us to get through these very difficult glacial periods, where in other parts of Africa, people may not have survived.
We know that on those ancient submerged ecosystems, there were large-bodied grazing species, giant buffalo, giant zebra, giant hartebeest. But here in the Cape, on the coast, the record that's really strong here and unique is the record for the transition to modern humans, people like us. So we make kind of a distinction between Homo sapiens, that's an anatomical representation, but modern humans, that's us, and that's only recognized through behavior. Many of the earliest evidence that we have for complex behavior is found here on the South African coast. So what are some of those features? First time people expand their diet to coastal food. The first, complex pyrotechnology, so using fire to modify raw materials. Earliest evidence for people collecting seashells. The first evidence we have for people grinding pigments. Earliest evidence we have for engraving ochre, engraving symbols on ochre. The earliest evidence we have for paint jars. Earliest evidence for what's a really complex form of stone tool type that we call microlithic technology. So the South African record has played a special role in our understanding of the origins of modern behavior.
So here we are in the heart of the Cape Flora, and the vegetation that I'm standing in is fynbos. It's the second richest concentration of plant species anywhere in the world, most of which are endemic. They grow nowhere else. The Cape region, particularly its southwestern corner, has remained relatively constant in its climate over the last million years or so. Many other parts of the world underwent huge changes in association with the glacial, interglacial cycles that have occurred across the globe. Because the climate remained fairly constant, evolution wasn't interrupted. So in the Cape region, we find examples of extremely ancient plants, and speciation has continued uninterrupted. And all this results in is a massive accumulation of species.
If you look across the landscape, we've got this amazing topography. We've got the underlying sandstones, what we're standing on now, very ancient soils, and very different from what's down below us here. So as you drop down into the valleys, there's this completely different geology where the sands have blown up from the coast with fluctuating sea levels. So these are actually deep valleys that have been filled with sand, with alkaline marine-derived sands. So high pH down there, low pH here, and a completely different set of species. And then obviously we've got the mountains, so we've got north-facing, south-facing, very different flora on the northern side to the southern side. All of these little habitat changes, and some of them are very subtle, resulting in different species.
Another intriguing factor that I always think about when I think about flowers in fynbos is how humans would have also, like the pollinators, have got cued into flowers, because so much of their food came from plants commonly called bulbs, plants with underground storage organs like this little morea. And they would have had to recognize the occurrence of the morea through the flower. And they would have to recognize within different moreas, because some are poisonous and some aren't. So their brains actually became wired to distinguish different types of bulbs, different types of plants.
There's a beautiful underground carbohydrate resource that lives in this Cape Floristic region. That's very advantageous for humans. It's predictable, you know?
There's a whole lot of species in the system, and they all vary in terms of bulb size and palatability.
Elzaan Singles is another student in our project who did a PhD about these bulbs. And she made a fascinating observation. She went to the veld just after it burned, right? And she went up to these Watsonias, and the fire in the veld had done all the processing for her. And you could just pick it up and put it in your mouth.
So there was a huge incentive then for people to burn the felt in those times, both to make the bulbs more apparent and more accessible, because a lot of them flower only in the first year or two after fire, but also because you're cooking your food. This provides the basis for fire stick farming, which means that people have probably been managing these landscapes. Many of the life histories we see today in Fynbos, particularly the ones that become so apparent after fire, might have been a co-evolution with human fire regimes.
I love that, eh? So it's a beautiful example of how humans were immersed within an ecosystem, not on top.
If we could go back 160,000 years ago and looked at Africa, you would see an environment that was wildly different than it is today. Much colder and much drier. For example, the Sahara Desert was twice as big. The Central African rainforest was gone. So we think that at that time, there were pockets of environments in Africa where modern humans could have thrived. Here in South Africa, during those glacial phases, the sea would have offered one of the most productive, richest and predictable food resources available. So for example, here on the West Coast, where the ocean temperatures are colder than they are on the East Coast, the biomass of collectible shellfish in the intertidal zone is higher here than it is in the warm waters. So cold waters, interestingly enough, produce a richer environment for a coastal forager.
Hey, look at this. It's not a great day. Look at this. I mean, quite a big swell. It is spring tide, so it's the lowest it's going to be in 2 weeks. But rough seas, but already food.
Yep,
Look at this. But look at the protein. Yep. I mean, we've got these huge limpets. Let's just get one off without damaging it. Look at that. How much protein is in that?
It's amazing.
Although we're on this ancient shore, humans, when they eat, always leave evidence. And we can see that someone had a pizza and some chippy junk food. Why am I looking at this? Because how we know what our ancestors ate is in what they left behind. And for that, we're going to go to what are called middens, full of the shells of marine life. So here we've got a midden, which is a collection of the hard bits of what our ancestors ate, or at least what recent foragers ate. What's interesting about this midden is we also have shards of worked stone. So someone here brought stone, there's another example, and used stones to fracture other stones to make tools. These would have been used to scrape the flesh out of the shells. We're standing on a coast that is at the intersection of the cold Benguela current and the warmer Agulhas current. Biologically, we're in an overlap zone where we still have productivity, we still have a lot of nutrients, but we also have warmer water. We have a mixture of species from both marine systems. So this was a fantastic shore to live on and a fantastic place to get food out of the sea.
What we find in the record for hunter-gatherers is when hunter-gatherers expand their diet to the seafood food chain, a whole lot of interesting things happen. They stop being so mobile, so they don't move about the landscape so frequently. They can even settle down into villages where they focus on the seafoods. The other important thing is when you lower mobility, you can start to invest in more complex technologies. So Coastal adaptations drive innovation, and that's why we see all these material cultural firsts on the South African coast. So there's a whole series of famous sites on the South African coast. Now, Klipgat was excavated twice. That site documents from about 90,000 years ago at the base up to almost the present. So there are deposits all the way at the top from hunter-gatherers a couple hundred years ago. We have a few hominid remains from De Kelders, and interestingly enough, the vast majority are naturally avulsed milk teeth. So those would have been children living in the cave, and the teeth get loose and they pull it out and they drop it. And that's what we found in the archaeological site. When early modern humans were walking this landscape, there would have been a community of animals very different than what we see today. And we have two forms of evidence for those species. One form of evidence is in the caves where we find their bones. And the other form of evidence is the trackways, actually the footprints of the animals. And you can see 3 footprints in front of you. 1, 2, 3. And these are footprints of a very large-bodied animal, either a giant buffalo, which was an animal probably 2 to 3 times the body size of the modern Cape buffalo, or the giant zebra. And they would have been walking across the ancient dune systems, which would have had vegetation probably on them at that time. And those footprints get preserved when the dunes lithify or turn to stone from calcium carbonate.
Most people think of paleontology in terms of the body fossils with the bones. So I don't deal with the bones, I deal with the tracks and traces. And the beautiful thing is how these two mesh together and the one complements the other. And you know, the body fossil record will show the gaps in our record and we'll show the gaps in the body fossil record, and together we piece together a more complete picture. And we're learning things about humans here that you would never learn from the body fossil record. We're seeing how people made patterns in the sand and how we're able to interpret those patterns today. What I'm seeing here are tracks that are a little bit longer than they are wide. So this creature was moving either this way or that way. And this is what tracks look like in profile. So the layer that the tracks were made in is gone. And this is all the infill of the tracks. This is very nice. Total length is 118. So that's 45. Oh, 45 and 45. It's a very hominin pace and stride. You know, if you've got time just to come and lie here under that surface and look up at it, when there's no hustle and bustle around, it's just you and those tracks. It's very easy to think profound thoughts about, you know, where we've come from, but also where we're going. And all the trouble that we're in today with climate change and rising sea levels again, it's all happened before. It happened to them. In a human lifetime, they would have seen the coastline shifts, and they had to adapt.
Because of the abundance of both seafood, the plants that you find in the fynbos, and the presence of the large grazing antelope, that created a tripartite rich source of food that allowed people to thrive here on the South African coast.
Considering this change within space and within time, the implication is that things are constantly changing, and this landscape, as it is right now, is just a fleeting snapshot of something that has never been quite the same and will never either be the same in the future either.
What I think is that in all of us, because we all came from here, is why this appreciation of biodiversity. And we need to get it back again. We need to re-fire up those bits of our brain. We were absolutely dependent on this biodiversity. And that's something which we realize now with climate change and all the kind of fraughtness that we face. That if we just have the simple rule, look after biodiversity, conserve biodiversity, keep that wealth of species alive, we're going to be okay.